Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer McGuire of Hero Arts. Hero Arts has recently released some stamp sets called color layering stamp sets. These sets have images that you stamp on top of each other to create something beautiful. I'm going to use a few of these sets to create two cards today on dark cardstock using embossing powder. This is a fun technique that results in bold color on a dark background. For the first card, I'm using this butterfly color layering stamp set. I have some black cardstock that I've cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm using my anti-static powder tool on it first, since we're going to do a lot of colorful embossing. I think it's really important to use something anti-static. You can use this anti-static powder tool or cornstarch or a dryer sheet. I have the bottom layer of the butterfly, the largest image. I'm inking that up well with Versamark ink, which is just a clear sticky ink. I'm going to stamp this towards the top center of my black cardstock. And I'm pressing very firmly because I want to make sure I get all that ink on my paper so that it holds lots of embossing powder. So I'm using a colorful opaque embossing powder from WOW here, and I'm starting with a pink color. You definitely want to use opaque for this so that the color is nice and bright against that dark color cardstock. So I'm shaking lots of this on here, and I'm going to tap it off lightly because I want to keep as much powder on there as possible, but make sure that we get all the powder away from around the image. We want to keep this nice and crisp. So now I'm going to heat set this with my heat gun. This is the Milwaukee heat gun that Hero Arts sells, and this is by far the best heat gun there is because it gets nice and hot. Now I have it on and I'm letting it get good and warm for about 30 seconds before I bring it to my paper. This allows the gun to be very hot so that the powder melts very quickly and you don't warp your paper as much. So there you can see the bright pink color against the dark background. So after this is cool, I'm just kind of waving it to cool it down. I'm going to take the next layer from this stamp set, so the second largest, and I'm going to stamp that right on top of the embossing that we've already done. So for this time, I'm going to go ahead and use the embossing powder again. I want to make sure there is no static on here because the colorful powder will stick to the dark background and make a mess. Okay, so I again am inking the stamp up with Versamark ink, and I am again going to press very firmly onto this because I want to make sure that that ink gets into any of the like uneven surface that might have resulted on that embossing powder. Next, I'm putting on some yellow embossing powder. I just wanted something bright that would contrast with the pink. And I'm going to use a clean paintbrush to brush away any excess powder that might stick anywhere. And then go ahead and heat set this. Again, make sure your gun is good and hot so that it melts right away, and that'll keep a nice crisp, clean image on top of the pink background that we already have there. So now it's time for another layer. Again, I'm going to use the anti-static powder tool here. And this is the third layer of the butterfly, inking it up with the Versamark ink, and I'm going to again press firmly on top of the stamping that we already have. Now, if you don't have colorful embossing powders, you can just use any inks and layer them up on white cardstock if you wanted to. You could also try to use colored pigment inks with clear powder, but you're not going to get as good a results. You really need a very opaque embossing powder. Thankfully, embossing powders are very inexpensive, especially these from WOW. So you can get a few colors for not much money. And the white, by the way, that I'm using here is the Hero Arts white. I've never been able to find a white as bright as the Hero Arts white. So I use that on top of the pink and the yellow. Okay, so now it's time for the body of the butterfly. I'm going to add that right on top, and you can see I'm just adding layer after layer of embossing on top of each other. This time I'm using Hero Arts silver embossing powder. Now I will say some powders might, if you heat it a little bit too long, it might kind of spread a little bit and allow some of the color from behind it, the other color of embossing powder, to show through, but that's okay. You can just stamp it and do it again if you need to. Once everything is good and cool, I'm just going to take a dry cloth and just buff away all of that anti-static powder tool that's in the background, the white powder, so that we have that nice, bright, crisp stamped image with all of those layers on the nice, dark black background. Now you could do this on other colors of cardstock. I just think that that black is kind of fun and something different. So now I need to stamp my sentiment underneath this, and I wanted to make sure it was centered. Now I could use a stamp positioner, or I could use a pencil line to draw it. This is the trick that I did. I just used some Post-it tape, and I'll reuse these pieces a few times, to just evenly block off an area on both sides of my card. This is going to help me line this up. Then I'm going to put a piece horizontally. I'm using the grid on my paper background to make sure I've got that straight across there. And basically I've just blocked off an area, so now I just have to center it in that little area, and that is easier for me to do. So this is just a quick trick to kind of center something up. By the way, this sentiment is from the Hero Arts graphic flower stamp set, which is another color layering. You could do the same technique with that stamp set and get really big, bold flowers. Again, I'm using my anti-static powder tool, and I can't stress enough how important putting something anti-static down first is, because these colorful powders will stick everywhere on the black cardstock. So now I'm going to stamp with my Versamark ink right centered in that bottom area there, and those post-it lines or those little guides are really helpful. I'm going back to that same yellow embossing powder, and I'm going to add that to the sentiment. It's really important not to tap off too much of this powder after you have poured it on. You can see I'm lightly tapping it. If you tap too much, what will happen is you'll knock too much of the powder off, and you'll see black cardstock through the yellow embossing powder. Okay, so now I can remove my Post-it tape strips, and I can save those for another card. And you can see the powder in the background, but that's okay. We can just buff that off with the cloth. I just use a microfiber cloth, but you could use a paper towel if you wanted to. So there we have our embossing complete, nice bold color against that black cardstock. And I couldn't get that without using those bright, bold embossing powders. Now it's time to put this card together. I did trim a 1/2 inch off the two sides, the left and the right, of my black panel so some of the white card would show. I also have cut a piece of black craft foam. This has a little bit of dimension to it. I've cut this slightly smaller than our black stamped panel, and I'm going to glue that in between the black stamped panel and the note card. This will give it a nice even raised dimension. If I used a foam tape here or foam squares, it would probably get crushed in the mail. So using this full piece of craft foam ensures that it has the dimension, but it will stay nice through the mail. You could also use white craft foam here if you wanted to, but I thought that this kind of hid a little bit better behind the black cardstock. I'm using a strong tape, this is score tape, to adhere these together, but you can use any strong adhesive that you may have. And finally, I'm going to go ahead and adhere this to a top folding white note card that I created, and this is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I decided to keep the focus on that bold, colorful embossing powder and keep the rest of the card simple. So next I wanted to share another example, and this is using the Birds and Branch stamp set from Hero Arts. This one also allows you to stamp several images on top of each other to create a beautiful bird. You can see all of the images there on the left. Now I've got the same black cardstock using some anti-static powder tool, and I'm starting with the largest, most solid image first and stamping that onto my background. Again, I want to press firmly because I want to get as much ink as possible onto that paper. So for this, I'm going to start with white embossing powder first. Again, my favorite white embossing powder is the Hero Arts, and I have little scraps of paper inside of my white embossing powder. I guess I should clean those out. So anyways, I'm going to very carefully tap off the excess and use a brush to remove any. Don't tap too hard or too much of the powder will come off and the black will show through. After heat setting that, I'm going to go ahead and stamp the next image on, and I still did use the powder tool in between each of these steps. This is really easy to see through the stamp and line up each time because you can just line up the beak and the tail and it'll be perfect. Next, I'm using a light blue opaque embossing powder and putting that right on top. Now this light blue, when I heated, I guess I heated it a little bit too long, and it kind of moved apart, and you can see some of the white showing through. However, I think that's really neat with this particular image, with this bird. It kind of adds a feel of texture. If you wanted it to be perfect though, just stamp the exact same image on top and do the same powder again. It just puts a heavier layer on top. I just left it as is and then did the third layer of the bird on top, and I'm using a darker blue embossing powder on this. And it's amazing how nice this ends up turning out. Now, if you don't have all these different colors of blue, if you have a regular blue and a white, you can mix your blue and white for that second layer and create a lighter blue. Okay, so now it's time to do the little eyes and beak, and I decided to use this silver from Hero Arts for that step, and I'll use that on the feet also. So there we have our bird starting to be formed. This bird is beautiful, stamped with different layers of colorful ink on a white background, and there's lots of examples over on the Hero Arts blog. Now for the branch, I wanted it to be longer, so I stamped it once to the left of the bird's tail, and I'm going to stamp just the end of it to the right of his tail to make it look like it's a little bit longer, and that way his tail is in front of the branch also. I used actually a brass embossing powder because I thought the brass would be a little more fun than a brown. And you can see how that looks nice against that black cardstock. Now you may have noticed that I'm using coffee filters with my embossing powder. I think it's a great way to kind of catch all your excess powder, and you just fold it and can funnel it back into the jar. And then you can tap off the coffee filter over your trash can and reuse it over and over again if you want to. I find it so much better than using a piece of typing paper. Okay, so I'm using an olive color embossing powder on the leaves here. That stamp set also has some flowers, but I decided to keep this pretty neutral. Last, we're going to stamp the little bird's feet on top of the branch with silver embossing powder and heat set that. So now we have this colorful layered images on the dark cardstock, and that you couldn't do with regular ink. You have to use embossing powders to be that bold on that dark background. I also stamped a hello friend message and white heat embossed that. That's from the same stamp set that I got the sentiment from the previous card. Okay, now for a few little berries on the branch, I'm just using some pink liquid pearls, and it just adds a little bit of dimension. When liquid pearls come out of the bottle, they kind of have a point at the top where it's squeezed out of the bottle. So what I do to round it out is I pick up my card and I flick it from behind pretty firmly, just to kind of tap and make sure that the perfect pearls kind of rounds out, and you end up with a perfectly nice round looking berry there. So there you have a fun way to use the color layering stamp sets with embossing powder to create bold color against a dark background. If you have any questions, please head over to the Hero Arts blog, and thanks for stopping by.